Marta entered her grandmother's house for the first time since her death, but something wasn't right. The door creaked as it opened, and the smell of aged wood instantly surrounded her. She took her first step into the dark corridor and felt a chill, as if something was watching her from the shadows. The silence was absolute, but the feeling of not being alone was palpable. She knew what her grandmother had left her, the house, the place where she grew up, but also the place that had always made her uneasy. Her grandmother, a woman of few smiles and many secrets, had never spoken about the house. Marta didn't understand why anyone would want this place, but she knew she had to sell it. The problem was that as soon as she entered, an uncomfortable sensation overwhelmed her. It was as if she was stepping into something that didn't belong to her, something that wanted to keep her there. Marta moved away from the door and advanced, trying to ignore the strange pressure on her shoulders. The shadows in the house seemed to move with her, and she couldn't escape the watchful gaze of the painting she saw on the left wall. The portrait was framed in a dark wood frame, with glass fogged by time. When Marta approached, the details of the image began to reveal themselves. The family depicted in the painting appeared happy at first glance, but the eyes of each member were different. It was as if the smile on their lips didn't reach, their eyes which were vacant and at the same time fixed on her. The faces didn't seem entirely human, not completely. She stopped in front of the painting for a few seconds, observing the scene. The woman and the man in the center were smiling, but their eyes carried a sadness that was hard to identify. Next to them, two children, perhaps their children, were holding hands. Their innocent faces pristine, but their gazes were empty. The portrait had a surreal quality, as if the figures were not entirely human. Maybe it's just my imagination, Marta thought to herself, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Even so, she couldn't help but feel strange, as though the painting was staring back at her. She continued her exploration of the house, trying to convince herself that she was just overreacting. But in her mind, the portrait remained there, in her field of vision, like a presence that refused to be ignored. If you're feeling the chills, subscribe for more scary stories. As night fell, Marta locked herself in her room. The wind was blowing hard outside, but the sound of the house seemed more intense, as though the old furniture held untold stories. She looked at the portrait once more through the crack in the door, one last glance before turning off the lights. And then, with heavy eyes, she fell asleep. That night, Marta couldn't sleep. The portrait, which seemed harmless at first, now unsettled her in an indescribable way. She tossed and turned in bed, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong with the painting. The silence of the house seemed filled with an invisible weight, as if every sound, even the wind outside, was trying to tell her something she didn't want to hear. When the clock finally struck 3 in the morning, Marta got up, determined to find out what was going on. She descended the stairs with her heart beating faster than usual. The house was dark, except for the moonlight filtering through the broken windows, casting an eerie glow down the corridor. Her hand trembled as she reached the end of the corridor, where the portrait was hanging. As though it were calling her, she couldn't resist and moved closer. Her eyes were heavy, but curiosity urged her forward. When she got closer, she noticed something strange. The family in the painting seemed to be moving. First, it was the woman in the center. Her eyes, which had seemed fixed on a distant point, were now directly focused on Marta. A shiver ran through her body. She stepped back a little, unwilling to believe what she was seeing, but when she looked again, the woman seemed even more real. Her eyes weren't just looking at Marta, they were following her. Marta took a step back, confused. The portrait stared at her with an intensity that was unnerving. She blinked, trying to rationalize what she was seeing, but something inside her knew it wasn't just a trick of the light or an illusion. There was something more, something alive in that painting. The idea that it might just be a nightmare comforted her for a moment, but then the wind rattled the windows. She saw a dark shadow move behind the broken glass. With her eyes still fixed on the painting, she could almost hear a faint voice whispering from within the canvas. A soft sound, almost inaudible, but it seemed to call her name. Marta quickly turned around, trying to find the source of the sound, but there was nothing. just the heavy silence of the house. And once again, the portrait seemed to be more vivid, more tangible. The eyes of the woman and all the family members now were completely focused on her. It was as if the painting was asking for something. She looked to the bottom of the painting, at the children of the family. And there, among them, a small detail made her shiver. One of the boys had a smile, but the smile was wrong. His teeth were sharper, and his expression, though childlike, seemed like something that didn't belong there. It was a terrifying sight, as if the boy were trying to tell her something, but his mouth curved unnaturally as if stuck in a grotesque smile. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing second. Marta could no longer take her eyes off the painting. Something inside her screamed for her to leave, but her feet were rooted to the floor as though the painting had taken control of her body. She felt a chill when she noticed that, at some point, one of the family members in the painting started to move. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the woman at the center of the painting was now leaning slightly forward, as if she were approaching Marta. A small movement, as though she were reaching out for her. With one final effort, Marta stepped back and finally let out the breath she'd been holding. The weight around her seemed to dissipate a little, but the feeling of not being alone remained, strong and threatening. She stepped away from the painting, but a part of her mind couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. What was going on? Could it be that the painting was alive? Or was she losing her mind? The whispers in her head wouldn't stop growing. If you're feeling creeped out, share this video with someone who loves a good scare. With her eyes fixed on the painting once again, Marta couldn't look away. She couldn't look at it the same way anymore. Something in it was calling her, pulling her inside, and she knew it wouldn't be easy to escape. Marta spent the entire night awake, her hands sweating and her mind restless. The images of the portrait and the whispers she had heard kept echoing in her head. She tried to rationalize, telling herself that she was just tired, that the fear was just a product of her imagination. But with every glance at the painting, she felt something more intense, more threatening. The portrait seemed to become more alive, more real, and she no longer knew what was fantasy and what was truth. Determined to find an explanation for what was happening, Marta got up at dawn and decided to investigate her grandmother's past. Maybe there was something, some secret buried in the walls of the old house that could explain the mystery she was living. The idea that everything could be just an old, forgotten family story troubled her, but she knew she had to try. The local library, small and stuffy, was empty when Marta entered. The shelves were filled with old books, with worn covers and yellowed pages. She asked one of the librarians for help, a man with a distant look, who pointed her to a section of local records. There she found some old newspapers and records, mentioning her grandmother's house. As she flipped through the pages, one story caught her attention. It was about a fire that had occurred in the house more than 50 years ago, where the family depicted in the portrait mysteriously disappeared. The story said that a series of strange incidents had happened on the property before the fire, with rumors that the house was cursed. People spoke of a dark presence and an obsessive artist who had lived in the house and who had created the painting that Marta was now staring at. The name of the artist was Alfonso Varela, a renowned painter at the time, but known for his obsession with capturing the essence of people in his paintings. The newspapers mentioned that he had been the last person to see the family before the fire, but he was never found after the event. The story said that he had been consumed by his own art, trying to capture souls in his works, making them live forever in the painting. Essence! The word echoed in Marta's mind as she closed the newspaper. The portrait on her grandmother's wall seemed to be exactly that. The feeling that the figures in the painting were watching her, waiting for something. Perhaps, Marta thought, that was why she felt so strange near the painting. The souls of everyone in the painting were still there, trapped. She spent the afternoon in the library, researching more about Alfonso Varela's life. He had become obsessed with capturing the soul of people, believing that art had the power to preserve the human essence beyond death. Some books spoke of his studies, others mentioned his descent into madness, his desperate search for something he believed could make people immortal. However, The most disturbing thing of all was what one of the records said: Varela didn't just paint souls. He trapped them in the canvases. And as he stated in his diaries, the soul of every person painted never leaves the canvas. It watches, it waits, until the next soul arrives. Marta felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she read. The painting she feared so much, the portrait of Varela's family, was not just a work of art. It was a prison, and if she kept staying in that house, she knew she would eventually become one of the prisoners of the painting. Her soul would be trapped, and she would live there, alongside those already trapped. She flipped through the book frantically, searching for more information, but what she found only made her more desperate. Varela hadn't been a normal painter. He had become an entity. His obsession with art and capturing souls had consumed his sanity, and he believed that the paintings he created became portals. Portals through which souls could watch the outside world but never escape. At the end of the book, Marta found a reference to a method for destroying the painting. It was Varela's final attempt to complete his work. He believed that by consuming someone's soul, he would finally achieve true immortality. To destroy the portrait, however, someone would need to sacrifice themselves, offering their essence to the painting. Only then could the trapped souls be freed, and the painting would be destroyed. Marta closed the book with a snap, panic filling her body. What Varela had done was not just an artistic experiment, it was a curse. The portrait with all its inhabitants was waiting for her. She knew that to destroy the painting, she would need to do what Varela suggested: offer her soul. But that meant she would never again see the light of day, never again feel the wind on her face or the freedom of being who she was. She sat down, stunned, in a chair in the library. The portrait was now more than ever in her mind. It was real, and she was getting closer to being consumed by it. If you're feeling creeped out, share this video with someone who loves a good scare. At that moment, Marta realized that her only chance of escaping was to destroy the painting. But to do that, she would have to sacrifice something she could never get back. Marta woke up once again in the middle of the night, her heart racing. The silence in the house seemed denser than ever, and the feeling that something was lurking, waiting to strike, only grew stronger. The words from Varela's journals echoed. In her mind, the soul of every being painted never leaves the canvas. It watches, it waits. She got up from the bed, her legs trembling, and made her way to the hallway. The family portrait was there, just like always, but now it seemed different. The woman in the painting looked more real. Her eyes, which had only seemed empty and watchful before, now looked sharp, filled with an expression of suffering, as though they were screaming for help. Marta hesitated, her stomach tightening as if a massive weight was pressing down on her. The portrait was calling to her in a way she could no longer ignore. As she got closer, Marta felt the air in the room become thicker. The atmosphere seemed to weigh on her, and the wind, which had previously been blowing softly through the broken windows, now became a sharp, whistling sound, almost like a warning. She stopped in front of the painting, her eyes locked on the ones in the frame. The child in the left corner, who had previously seemed harmless, now had a grotesque smile, its sharp teeth glowing unnaturally. The child's gaze seemed to mock Marta. A sense of pressure settled in her chest. Marta stepped back but couldn't take her eyes off the painting. Then, the figure of the woman in the center began to move. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the woman leaned forward, and her eyes, which had been static before, fixed themselves on Marta with an unbearable intensity. Fear took hold of Marta. She tried to turn and run, but her feet were stuck to the floor. She could no longer move. The house seemed to transform as if the walls were closing in, creating a prison she couldn't escape from. The portrait was dominating the environment, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. That's when she heard for the first time the whispers. They weren't vague or distant anymore. Now they seemed to emerge directly from the painting, as though the voices of the family members were coming out of the canvas. They spoke in unintelligible words, but Marta could feel the urgency and despair in their voices. The words began to become clearer, and what they said made her tremble. "You can't leave," the woman's voice said. "You are connected now." Marta shut her eyes tightly, trying to block the words, trying to push away the sounds. She knew what was happening, but she didn't want to believe it. The portrait was trapping her soul, just as Varela had done with the souls of the family. She didn't know what would become of her if she couldn't escape, but something was holding her back. The pressure in her chest grew, and she felt as if she were being possessed by the painting, as if the figures were trying to capture her, as if the portrait was becoming an extension of her own soul. She looked back at the woman's eyes, now closer, now more alive. The painting was breathing, it was feeling her. If you're feeling creeped out, share this video with someone who loves a good scare. With one final effort, she tried to pull. Away from the canvas, her soul screaming, trying to resist. But the fight was far from over. Marta didn't know how to deal with the house anymore. The fear she felt since the previous night had turned into a constant feeling of pursuit. With every movement, it seemed like the portrait was watching her, always there, always waiting. Its eyes were fixed on her, and her mind began to lose control of the idea that maybe it was the painting itself that was manipulating her perception. She tried to resist, tried to run away from the house, but something was stopping her. She couldn't. It was as if the painting had become rooted in her mind, as if it had become part of her, as if her soul was already being pulled into the canvas, waiting for the right moment to be consumed completely. Each time she looked at the portrait, the feeling of loss became more intense. She felt her own essence being drained, as if the eyes of the woman, now more alive, were sucking away her memories, her emotions. She tried to pull away, but her mind couldn't stop thinking about it. The house began to feel more distant. Every time Marta tried to call someone, to ask for help, a feeling of emptiness surrounded her. Her friends started to notice that something was wrong. The calls became shorter, her words more empty. She pushed them away, unintentionally, but without, realizing that she no longer had control over what was happening. She felt as if she was being disconnected from the outside world. The portrait remained there in the living room. Sometimes Marta would spend hours staring at it, simply observing the figures that stared back at her with empty eyes. And, as time went on, the figures became more human, more real. The expressions on the faces of the family members became more detailed, more anguished. It was as if, for some reason, they knew she was there, trying to escape, trying to understand. Marta didn't know what to do. She tried to sleep, but the nightmares would wake her up constantly with images of the portrait invading her mind. She woke up sweating, her heart racing, and the portrait seemed closer to her now, more intense, more alive. On one of those nights, she decided that she couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. Something inside her knew that she couldn't wait anymore. The portrait was dominating her reality, and she couldn't allow this to happen. The painting was absorbing her, consuming her little by little, and she knew that if she didn't act now, she would have no chance of escaping. She approached the painting with a visceral sense of terror. Her eyes were fixed on the woman at the center of the canvas, who seemed more alive than ever, her eyes now penetrating, as if she were waiting. Marta took a deep breath, a final attempt to stay sane. She needed to find a way to destroy the painting before it was too late. But when she looked again, the woman's eyes glowed and something inside Marta seemed to break down. It was as if she were being pulled into the canvas, as if the painting had merged with her, as if the last soul to be consumed was hers. In the reflection, Marta saw a figure that was no longer entirely human, but also not completely the same. She felt the weight of the canvas on her soul, as if part of herself had been left behind. If you're feeling scared too, hit like and share with your friends. Marta knew she couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. Every night she spent in the house, her mind grew heavier, her emotions more turbulent. The portrait was becoming more than just a painting. It seemed to be the center of everything, the dark heart that pulsed in the house. And the more she tried to dismiss the idea that it was alive, the more the whispers and visions attacked her. It was with this obsession that Marta returned to the local library, this time determined to find out everything she could about the painter Alfonso Varela and his connection to the portrait. She knew the key to understanding what was happening lay somewhere, perhaps in an old diary or a record she had missed. She searched for hours, her eyes tired and her mind clouded with tension. Finally, a leather-bound book caught her attention. It was an old text with yellowed pages and a worn cover. The title was almost illegible, but Marta could make out the words, "The Art of Immortality." She opened the first page, and as she read, she knew she had found what she was looking for. The book was a collection of Varella's writings, a combination of his personal notes and excerpts from his diary, revealing the depth of his obsession with art and the capturing of souls. Varela believed that true immortality was not in living physically forever, but in preserving the essence of a person within his art. He believed that souls could be trapped, that the traits of a life could be fixed in a painting in such a way that the person lived there forever. The most disturbing part was what she read on one of the last pages, where Varela described his process in detail. He explained that capturing a soul was not simple. He needed emotional intensity and a deep connection with the person being painted. He spoke of how the strongest emotions, fear, anguish, sadness, were essential for capturing the essence. And in a moment of apparent clarity, Varela mentioned that the painting was not finished until the painter or the model was consumed by it. Marta felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she read. The portrait she had feared, the portrait of Varela's family, wasn't just a work of art, it was a prison. And if she continued staying in the house, she knew she would eventually become one of the prisoners in the painting. Her soul would be trapped, and she would live there alongside those already imprisoned. She flipped through the book frantically, looking for more information, but what she found only made her feel more desperate. Varela had not been a normal painter. He had become an entity. His obsession with art and capturing souls had consumed his sanity, and he believed that the paintings he created became portals. Portals through which souls could watch the outside world, but never escape. At the end of the book, Marta found a reference to a method for destroying the painting. It was Varela's last attempt to complete his work. He believed that by consuming someone's soul, he would finally achieve true immortality. To destroy the portrait, however, someone would need to sacrifice themselves, offering their essence to the painting. Only then could the trapped souls be freed, and the painting would be destroyed. Marta closed the book with a snap, panic flooding her body. What Varela had done was not just an artistic experiment, it was a curse. The portrait, with all its inhabitants, was waiting for her. She knew that to destroy the painting, she would need to do what Varela suggested, offer her soul. But that meant she would never again see the light of day, never again feel the wind on her face, or the freedom of being who she was. She sat down, stunned, in a chair in the library. The portrait was now more than ever in her mind. It was real, and she was getting closer to being consumed by it. At that moment, Marta realized that her only chance of escaping was to destroy the painting. But to do that, she would have to sacrifice something she could never get back. Want more stories like this? Subscribe now and prepare for the worst. Marta was paralyzed. The words from Varela's journals echoed in her mind like a dark chant, a cruel truth she didn't want to accept. The painting, the curse that had consumed her since the first glance, was now more alive than ever. The figures in the portrait seemed to pulse, their features now sharper and their eyes deeper, as if they could see directly into her soul. She felt an overwhelming pressure on her chest, as if an invisible hand was tightening around her throat. She tried to take a step back, but she couldn't move. It was as if the painting had rooted her to the spot, trapping her in its grip. The silence of the house felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in on her. There was no escape. She knew. She had to do something. If she stayed there any longer, she would be consumed by the painting, just like all the others who had been trapped in it before her. The idea of offering her soul to destroy the portrait seemed both terrifying and inevitable. There was no way out. Marta felt the presence of the souls trapped in the painting, their gazes fixed on her, their eyes accusing her of not acting sooner. The weight of their expectations was unbearable. She knew that the only way to break free from the painting's grasp was to sacrifice herself, to give up her own essence to free them. But she didn't know if she had the strength to do it. The portrait was pulling her in, and she could feel the sharp, cold fingers of the trapped souls reaching out to her, drawing her closer. The struggle was becoming more intense with every passing second. The painting was alive. And it wasn't going to let her go without a fight. She was trapped, not only by the portrait but by her own fear and the inevitability of what was to come. She had become part of the painting. It was too late to go back now. She stepped toward the canvas, her hand trembling. The family in the painting seemed to move as she did, their eyes following her every motion. They were waiting for her to give herself up, to become one with them. The closer she got to the painting, the more she felt her soul slipping away from her, as if the canvas were absorbing it, piece by piece. Just as she was about to touch the painting, her heart pounding in her chest, she heard a voice, soft but clear, inside her head. "You belong to us now." The voice was not from the painting itself, but from within her mind. She was being consumed, body and soul, by the curse of the painting. Do you dare to watch until the end? Subscribe to see what's next. With a final, desperate cry, Marta reached out for the canvas, knowing that it would be the last time she ever felt the warmth of the real world again. She closed her eyes as the darkness enveloped her. Marta fought against the pain that seemed to consume her. The sensation of being swallowed by the painting intensified with every second, as if the canvas itself had become an extension of her body, pulling her soul into an endless abyss. She felt the souls around her, the pressure of the figures trapped within that dark artwork. But in the midst of the darkness and desperation, something awakened inside her, a final spark of resistance. With a silent scream, Marta used all her strength to push away the pain and push herself out of the painting. She didn't know if her soul was still in her body or if it had already been consumed, but somehow she managed to step back from the canvas, feeling the cold and heavy air surrounding her once again. The room seemed to spin, and for a moment, she wasn't sure where she was. But one thing was certain: the portal was still there, alive as never before. The woman in the center of the painting was still staring directly at her, her smile now wider, more victorious. But something was different. The painting was decaying, as if Marta's act of resistance had begun to break the force that kept it intact. The figures within the painting started to distort, their forms crumbling as if the canvas was slowly falling apart. Marta fell to the floor, panting, while the pain in her soul still reverberated through her body. She looked at the portrait one last time. The souls of the family, now blurry and indistinct, seemed to be trying to free themselves, but something was wrong. The painting was beginning to disintegrate, and at the same time the figures within it seemed to scream in silence, as if the very act of destruction was consuming them. With the last strength she had, Marta managed to stand up. The painting was no longer the same. Its colors had faded, and the canvas seemed to be decaying as the figures became shadows, their details now lost. The woman at the center, once so powerful and menacing, now appeared only as a blurry image, like a faint memory trying to hold on to reality. Marta felt a shiver run down her spine as she realized what was happening. The souls trapped within the painting were being freed, but at what cost? The portrait was no longer just a piece of art. It had become part of her. Her soul was still tethered to the canvas, and she couldn't escape its pull. Even as the painting crumbled, she felt the weight of it on her, like a mark that would never be erased. She looked into the mirror on the opposite wall, and there, in the reflection, she saw something that made her stop. Her image was there, but something was wrong. The eyes of the woman in the painting were now reflected in her own face, as if the painting had merged with her, as if the last soul to be consumed had been hers. In the reflection, Marta saw a figure that was no longer entirely human, but also not entirely the same. She felt the burden of the canvas in her soul, as if part of herself had been left behind. Marta tried to move away from the mirror, but the sensation of being watched never left. Even though she was physically out of the painting, part of her soul was still trapped within it, and the image of her own distorted face was a constant reminder that she would never be fully free. As she walked toward the door, the last thing she felt was the presence of the painting. She knew somehow that in time, the portrait would call her back. It would never let her go. Want more stories like this? Subscribe now and prepare for the worst. The painting, now destroyed, left an indelible mark on her soul. Marta had escaped, physically, but her essence had been transformed, and she knew that at some point the painting would call her back. She would never truly escape.